Oh, nice. New video from Emil.
Hey everybody, and welcome to today's video where we'll be discussing the most interesting subject in climbing: grades. I've made an attempt at grading a bunch of different climbing exercises so that it's much easier for you to tick a new grade, essentially.
Easier to tick a new grade.
And then lastly, adding 2x your body weight, that starts to get pretty heavy, and I put that at V10.
Well, I have been stuck at a bit of a plateau, so let's give this double body weight pull-up a go. Hey, mackerel, my legs are tired. That is a V11. I'm pretty confident I'm not going to be ticking anytime soon. We're of course talking about Emil's recent video where he tried to grade a bunch of feats of strength, including a pull-up, some hangboard stuff and campus work. If you haven't seen it, you need to go check it out, and I'll add a link to that in the description below. And Emil did actually a really good job of doing a survey to get a consensus of what these feats of strength might be if you were to grade them in a bouldering scale, the V scale in this case. However, here at Lattice, we also do a bunch of testing with our own athletes to help assess their current strengths and see where that sits relative to the other climbers climbing at that grade. So let's break it down and see what grades people are actually climbing for the levels of strength that we saw in Emil's video. We don't actually measure every test or every feat of strength that Emil goes through in his video, but we do measure a few of the big ones, including pull-up strength and finger strength. So we're going to dive into those numbers. I should also caveat at this point that I am not very good at maths and statistics myself. So if I butcher any of the explanations of this data, I do apologize, and go easy on me in the comments. Before we go into the actual levels of strength, I'm going to present the data in a few different ways. The first way is we're going to look at the feat of strength that Emil presented. For example, the 2 times body weight pull-up. And we're going to show you what our models might predict a climber is actually climbing if they're performing that level of strength. Then we're also going to look at the grade the survey predicted. So for example, if it was V11, we're going to tell you what levels of strength we typically see from V11 climbers and see if there's a difference between those two predictions. I'm also going to give you the female model prediction because we know generally there are going to be differences in physical attributes between the different sexes. Basically, our female model is going to show that females are having less finger strength or less pulling strength, but making up for that in other areas in climbing, whether that be flexibility or technique. I'm going to also make the assumption that Emil's video is predominantly showing a male perspective in that survey. Last time I checked, our YouTube channel was about 87% male viewing, so I'm going to assume if he was asking his YouTube followers to fill out a survey, it's probably mostly a male perspective. First up, we're looking at finger strength, and we're going to look at the 2 times body weight hang. So that is adding an additional load of your entire body weight to a harness and hanging off an edge. Based on our male data set, this is what you'd expect to see for someone climbing around V16. As you'd expect though, we don't have data from hundreds of V16 climbers, so we have to extrapolate a bit from the data we do have. And also when we are testing V16 climbers, it's quite rare that we're going to get them to do a double body weight hang. We're more likely to use our digital assessments and force plates and do one arm hanging because it's much easier to do, and especially the shoulders, as Emil mentioned, can be a limiting factor here. So if we're looking at finger strength, in V16 climbers, we typically won't be doing a double body weight hang. We don't expect all climbers of a certain grade to be scoring the same levels of strength. We expect there to be a distribution centered on that mean. And we can also model how large that spread would be. For example, if we're looking at male V13 climbers, that level of strength would be 1 whole standard deviation above the mean score for that V13 grade. i.e., you would be in the top 13% of V13 climbers if you had that level of finger strength. So we would see it, it's just going to be much less common. But Emil's consensus of V10, I think, is pretty sandbagged, and you might start to see this theme running through some of the other measures in this video. As for women, this score we'd expect to see from the hypothetical average V17 climbers, or from the top female climbers. Like I just said, Emil's consensus was V10 for this, and we've actually tested quite a lot of V10 climbers, so we have a good amount of data here. For the male climber, the average score is coming around 157% of body weight hung, and for female climbers that would be around 151% of body weight hung. Unfortunately, these V10 climbers are going to need to do a lot of hangboarding if they're ever going to tick this V10. Next up, we have the one arm hang. At this level of strength, we're seeing an average of around V13 or V14 in male climbers and around V15 hypothetically in women climbers. But again, we don't have that much data in that model, particularly for the female climbers, so we are extrapolating one standard deviation above V12, where we do have a lot more data points. It is technically easier to hang one arm with full body weight than it is to hang two arms with double body weight, and this shows in Emil's consensus as well, as the prediction was V9 for that one arm hang. The average V9 climber is actually hanging around 91% of body weight for the male dataset and 84% of body weight for the female dataset. Next up, the double body weight pull-up, or the 200% pull-up. Unfortunately, we just don't have much data around this level of strength to be helpful and give a good suggestion. But we can tell you Emil is freaking strong. He's actually in the top percentile of our dataset. Emil's guess was V10 and the consensus pipped it to about V11. However, I can tell you that is probably going to be a really hard V10 at that level of strength. Our dataset would suggest V10 climbers are pulling around 162% of their body weight for the male dataset and 159% of their body weight for the female dataset. If we look at the 175% body weight pull-up, so adding 75% of your body weight in addition for that pull-up, we can see that male climbers are actually averaging around V15, and hypothetically, female climbers would be averaging around V16 here. Again, these are still quite high numbers, so we don't have much data here, and so we are extrapolating from the slightly lower grades around V12 and V13. But you could guess a double bodyweight pull-up, that 200% pull-up, is going to be pretty rare even amongst the best climbers. I did ask Ian to take a look at the front lever as well, because we do use this in our assessments. However, it just doesn't correlate that well with grades, so we can't give you a helpful answer on what level of lever lift you should be doing. It's one of those tests we would add into assessment because it really helps with a coach's interpretation depending on the client's goals and orientation. So if that climber, for example, wanted to climb on a really steep horizontal roof with a lot of foot switches and they were really poor at a front lever, that would be helpful information. Likewise, if they were a high-level climber, but they specialized at vertical climbing on hard granite, the lever lift is going to be pretty much useless in most cases. My take is V7 for a front lever is quite harsh. But saying that, there's also going to be a lot of V7s out there where being able to do a front lever would be really helpful. In general, I think the consensus is massively sandbagged. However, this brings us some really interesting questions about how we came to this consensus in that survey. But before we get into that, I do have a few more data caveats to put in here. The first is our data set has a selection bias. That means people that are more likely to come and do an assessment with us are already pretty motivated to be training and performing exercises like the ones we've seen in Emil's video. You might actually think that this would inflate the scores, that people that are more likely to do more training than actual climbing would come and do assessments to inform more training. But we are still way underneath some of those subjective grades that Emil showed in that survey. I think the more training becomes cool in its own right and becomes more popular, we are going to see climbers get stronger and stronger at these feats of strength. Secondly, not all grades mentioned here come from really quality data. Some of the big grades mentioned, like V15 for women, are extrapolated from smaller data sets of a reasonable sample size of up to 12. Also, our tests are not like for like. For example, Emil asked you what a 5-second hang would be like, but we typically test a 7-second hang. So it's a 2-second difference, but it can make quite a difference to the overall weight that you can hang. Emil asked about a 1 rep max pull-up, and we typically test a 2 rep max pull-up. We typically expect a 2 rep max to be about 95% of a 1 rep max, which is what we've used to compare to Emil's 1 rep max. I also want to recognize the subtle difference that Emil's survey was asking us to grade a feat of strength, and our data kind of does it the other way around. We're looking at the level of strength for a certain grade. The assumption here is that if you had a feat of strength graded V9, for example, that roughly 50% of V9 climbers would be able to perform that feat of strength. We've said this before, but it's worth reiterating that when we're looking at data like this, there are always going to be outliers on both sides of the graph. So when you get really strong climbers for a given grade, you're also going to get really weak climbers for a given grade. And I think Dave Graham is a perfect example of this, who's actually had one of the best years of climbing in his life, but would always say that he's a pretty weak climber when it comes to just physical feats of strength. So this brings me to my questions of why these feats of strength have been graded so hard when surely most of the climbers actually climbing these grades can't perform these feats of strength themselves. It's not a small group of people that filled out the survey after all. There's a lot of people which suggested that these feats of strength were that grade. So it's a pretty good consensus, as Emil pointed out in his video. I love this comment from Emil. He says, the consensus doesn't lie. And that is true, but just because it's not a lie doesn't mean it's accurate. There might be two scenarios going on here. The first is that a lot of the people voting aren't actually able to perform these feats of strength, at least the ones in the higher levels, and are extrapolating from their own experience. However, you have to be careful how you extrapolate from your own experience, because strength and power gains are not going to increase linearly through your training process. It's going to reduce over time with the law of diminishing returns, meaning to get to those really high levels of strength is going to be really difficult for a lot of climbers. The other thing that might be going on is that Emil's consensus or survey has a completely different selection bias to our data set, and actually perhaps it's pulling in people that can perform some really incredible feats of strength but aren't putting down the same grades as the people we test here at Lattice. The nice thing about climbing is there's so many different ways to get to the same endpoint and climb a boulder problem. Another point is that if you can already do a feat of strength, it generally feels a lot easier and repeatable than doing a boulder problem or a climb. You also have the opportunity to practice it a lot more than a given climb. Imagine a pull-up, for example. You might have done the same movement thousands of times, but you're very unlikely to have done any climb thousands of times. So that movement is going to feel relatively easy and really low skill level. Perhaps if you had done a V9 thousands of times, it would be really hard to grade at V9 because of muscle memory and being able to be so efficient on it. That brings me to another thought, which is, are they graded so low because they are not climbs, because they're just simple movements? And if you take away the whole skill aspect of it, perhaps there's a fear or mental element that goes into climbing as well. If you remove that, does that automatically make it easier? Another thing we see in climbing a lot is that when you're working a project, it can feel really hard or impossible, but sometimes it just clicks. And if you repeat the climb, it can also feel like it's much easier than the process first led you to believe. So once you're able to do a feat of strength, you're probably more likely to start downgrading it than you are to really remember the process and difficulties that went into actually doing it in the first place. I want to know what your thoughts are on this subject. We're looking at quite a subjective measure in that survey to quite an objective measure where we've actually had people do these tests and ask them their grades. However, both of these are not perfect. Even the tests themselves and looking at these data models are still not perfect. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment below. Also, if you are interested in doing some of these tests and getting an understanding of where your strength lies relative to your grade, remember we have a remote assessment that you can do in your own gym, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Also, a massive thank you to Emil for posting this video in the first place. It's such an interesting topic and his channel is really amazing, so you have to go over there and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.